Hi, welcome to episode 2 of the Save Planet podcast. Today, I'm very excited. We have a great new guest for you today. Her name is Dr. Janya Kelly. She is a climate change scientist, and her background is phenomenal. She went to Dalhousie University to get her undergrad in Bachelor's of Physics and went to York to get her PhD. So today, we are here to talk to her about the atmosphere because she is now a climate change and air quality specialist at Golden.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, Dr. Kelly, if you could take a minute and just tell us a little bit more about how did you become a climate change scientist?
Really, it was honestly by asking a lot of questions. So when I started in my undergrad, I was fortunate to be in a department that had a strong atmospheric program, and that appealed to me a lot more than the theoretical or the technical physics that was going on, the research that was going on in the department. It was all very interesting, but I found it fascinating that we knew how clouds, we knew that it snows.
Yes,
And
we're in Canada.
we know that. Yeah, we know that. And they knew how ice crystals formed, but they couldn't actually predict the shape. So when you look at ice crystals of snow on a very small scale, they have many different shapes, and they couldn't quite
Right.
figure out the models to predict what that shape would be. And I found that fascinating for the amount of time that we've been on this earth, that we know it snows, and we can't model that first step. And I thought, that's interesting. That can be something I can look into. There is space in this field for me. And then from that, I was able to do my co-op degree as that was available for my undergrad. And in my co-op degree, I specifically chose positions that had to deal with atmospheric research. Eventually, I looked into planetary atmospheres because that seemed very cool. It's not
Yes.
a very open field in Canada, not a lot of research as much going there. So I decided maybe that's not the best place if you don't want to move.
Yes.
To kind of lean into, and that's where I was fortunate to have mentors. And when you're going through school, you pay your tuition, you pay for your books, but you got to realize as part of that, you've got access to these incredible minds and professors. And so you need to ask those questions. You need to reach out to them to find out what they think. How did they get to where they are? Where are the open areas in the fields that they see? And that led me to the connection at York with my supervisor there, who put me on a project that was a little bit different because I was looking at how aerosols form in the atmosphere on the air quality side of things, which is an important first step for the models. And from that, I could move into a postdoc at Environment Canada, where I looked at the future impact of climate on air quality across North America. So it really came down to being open and constantly asking questions of those around me and my mentors to find out what fields were opening up and what needs to be studied, and does that interest me. And then the final step, my supervisor during my PhD was actually a consultant for 7 years before she became a professor. And because of that, she exposed all of her graduate students to a little bit of consulting, a little bit of teaching, a little bit of research. She took a lot of effort to mentor us to find out what best fit our interests and personalities, and then hooked us up with contacts that she had in those fields. So I was able to join the group at Golder, who and the contact I had there actually trained her to be a consultant. So it ends up being a very small world in the end.
Well, I imagine your field is quite small, but it's becoming increasingly important because
Yes.
just with all the different changes, like for example, this weekend I heard over the news. This seems significant. Was that there are 21 different names that they allocate to storms for the year, I'm told, and they're on their last one, which, considering we're in September, is alarming if we've already gone through 21 major storms throughout the world. So the atmosphere is becoming increasingly important, especially with how it's changing and everything. So
Yeah.
this is, yeah, I find this a very fascinating field, and I'm glad you're able to be here with us to share this with us. So um, now I know that in terms of uh, what you do at Golder, you are being with climate change and air quality, you work on a lot of different projects. Now, we're not going to get into the specifics of those projects. What are the first three things that you need to look for in order to help determine the impact of climate change on those projects?
So when I'm looking at a project, I'm going to answer this in two different ways because
Okay.
there really is two different approaches. And then there's the honest consultant answer, which is you always look at the budget and the deliverable date.
Yeah.
But I'll skip that one. When we're looking at a project and when we want to find out how to either incorporate climate change or look at the impacts, the first question we want to ask ourselves is how does this project feed into the client's sustainability objectives? And so the language has changed a little bit from climate change objectives to sustainability, because sustainability provides a lot more of a wholesome big picture. You're not just looking at the climate aspect, you're looking at climate and all these other different areas. They all come into it. So it's usually one pillar there.
Okay.
And that's important. So first of all, do they have one? And if they don't, that's something we can help them with. Or um, if they have one, what are their objectives? What's important to them so we can help them achieve those goals through the project maybe? The second thing that we want to understand is how does what we're doing fit into the project as a whole? So we may be a subcomponent of the project. We may be developing data or providing data to another team. So you had Chris
Okay.
Davidson on last week.
Yes.
Part of my job is to give him numbers so he can go and make his hydrological models. So I need to
Oh, okay.
understand how his models use the climate data, but also what is the end goal of those models? So that lets me know where the sensitivities are and where can we have more uncertainty? Where do we need to be really sure? How do we approach the project? And the last thing, which is the most critical, is how do we take this technical information and make it practical? So when you're communicating about climate change, when you're communicating about the project as a whole, it needs to be meaningful to your audience. So when you're writing this report, who are you writing to? If you're writing to an engineer who's on the floor of a facility trying to
Mhm.
implement all the stuff you've just said, you need to have a lot of details. You need to have a lot of backup. You're really getting into the methodology and you're really getting into calculations. If you're, say, writing the report for the person who signs the checks, you're going to write it at a slightly higher level so they can speak about it knowledgeably to both the person on the floor, the engineer,
Mhm.
and corporate above them. And then you need to also be able to help them communicate it to corporate, because if corporate doesn't understand the value of what you're doing, they're probably not going to want to do it again.
Yes.
And we want to help them incorporate this and embrace this the same way that we have seen companies embrace health and safety as part of their culture. We want them to embrace climate change and that climate lens on their projects as part of their culture. So that's where that practical aspect becomes really critical.
For our viewers and listeners, Chris Davidson is a water engineer that we had on last week. And basically, he does something very similar, but for stormwater and
Mhm.
collection and such. Just a quick background there. How do I mitigate these climate changes? Because I know that your model is good. I think Chris said to 2050.
Climate models are out to about 2100 right now. That's where they
Okay.
stop.
Okay. So to 2100, which is 80 years, that's pretty tough to predict the future. So can you give us some examples of these kind of climate mitigation strategies that have changed projects? Like a few examples so that our listeners know how do you help mitigate the climate change, especially since we're dealing with the atmosphere?
So there's a couple things that you can do. Now, one thing just to clarify at this point, climate change mitigation often refers to reducing the amount of greenhouse gases associated with a project,
Oh, okay. Yes.
which is, but people also say we need to mitigate or introduce mitigation actions for climate change, and they mean that more in the terms of adaptation. So it's
Okay.
not fair to you because people use the both words, two different definitions. So greenhouse gases, yes, you can reduce those. There's a lot of things you can look at by sourcing different materials or looking at different approaches for it, but that's not necessarily going to help with resilience in the long term, except that there's going to be less GHGs and less impacts. When you look at impacting a project's or reducing the impacts of climate on a project or increasing its resilience, now you've got to be a bit smarter. You've got to look at what you're doing.
Okay.
What aspects of your design have anything to do with the atmosphere or the natural environment? And if there's a change in that natural environment around you,
Okay.
is your infrastructure, is your project still going to be operational? So if you've gone and you've designed a bridge or a culvert or any system that involves water or going
Hmm.
over water, you've got to look at the resilience of your materials in terms of how the actual weather's changing. But you also have to think about the fact that precipitation patterns are changing, especially in Canada. And so now that you're getting less frequent, more intense events potentially,
Hmm.
you have to design to a higher standard. And you have to make sure that your infrastructure is going to be able to withstand the flow of water. And not just the flow of water, now are your banks around your infrastructure, are they at the right slope? If you have this extra rainfall event, are you going to have washouts? Are you going to have erosion? If
Oh,
you assume in the future that you're going to be able to look at reclaiming any land areas that you've been working with and introducing the flora and fauna again, will those flora and fauna grow under future climate conditions? Because if that was your plan and you don't look to see if the temperature or rain changes are going to impact those species, then your plan may not work in the future. And so you have to understand what's happening now.
yes.
So understand your environment now, understand what can change, what is climate science saying may change. And if you apply those changes to your project, does it still operate successfully in the future? And there are changes that can happen that have very little impact on your project because it's just not sensitive. But there's other ones that can be very sensitive, like the availability of water or how and when you're getting that water.
Basically, depending on the project, these types of atmospheric changes with the climate will affect whether might affect it or might not affect it. But basically, some sort of study has to be done before you
Yeah,
can even verify the feasibility of your project. So
yeah.
if there are any project managers listening, uh, sorry, that's an extra step you now have to take. You have to make sure that environmentally it's feasible. And that's not really in any Canadian regulations right now that we have to
Not
do this.
yet. Not yet. It is coming. It is in the Impact Assessment Act. As part of any new project that's undergoing an environmental assessment, you do have to look at the potential impacts of climate change on the project. The guidance for that is still evolving. They don't have a lot of details. Another thing is some provincial guidance does require it. So provincial guidance on EAs or environmental assessments, yes, it's climate change has been there for a little bit. But what we're seeing is there's some jurisdictions like BC where they have very specific guidance for how climate change needs to be considered. The other thing that happens with that is as climate science and climate knowledge evolves, you may have older regulations that are no longer as helpful. So just increasing everything by 10 or 15%. Well, what if your rate of change in your area is higher? If you default back to the 15%, you're not going to be resilient,
No.
but you follow the regulation. So that's that's where I think we see a little bit less coming from regulations. Engineers Canada, as
Hmm.
well as the global level engineering body, I'm personally not an engineer, as well as in Ontario and across the country, as part of their code of ethics, they want you to look at climate change. And they don't provide a lot of guidance on how to
No,
do this
no, they do
beyond,
not.
if you don't know it yourself, go find a smart friend who does and
Yes.
learn from them and get them involved. Or they are involved in a lot of research around climate and climate resilience and how to do climate risk assessments as well. So the guidance isn't necessarily coming from the regulators. Where you'll see a lot of questions coming from and where you'll see a lot of the guidance coming from is the people who hold the money.
Yeah.
So it's banks. Banks that are funding projects will ask you for climate information. If I'm going to give you this money, show me it's going to work for a long time. Insurance. Insurance drives a lot of research in climate change because they have to pay out to people if stuff happens.
Yep.
And so they want to make sure that if they're insuring your home, that you're doing everything you can um, to follow the latest recommendations to keep it resilient. And they're looking at multiple things that way. And there's new requirements in Canada from the banks that you have to have climate disclosure. And we're seeing stakeholders, people who want to invest in your company. Well, now we have a new generation of investors, and one of the questions they ask is, how is your company going to be sustainable? Show me how your company is considering climate change. What is your plan to help the planet? And they'd rather invest in companies that are seen as greener or more sustainable because there's a longevity, a resilience there. So it's not coming the way you think it will. And then the last area that you'll see it is honestly lawsuits. We've started to see that in the States,
Yes.
but it'll
Now,
change what is considered best guidance when you're doing a project.
for these models, because they go to 2100, and we have there have been protocols like the Kyoto protocols and other kind of legislation. Do the models take that into account, or does it kind of, until you start to see the implementation, those models are based on us kind of just going forward with the way we've been doing it the last 50 years? Could you give us a little more information of how these models work so that, in terms of prediction, are they kind of the worst case scenario or kind of a middle road, or the best case scenario that, by 2030, we've been able to reduce greenhouse gases to a low level? How do the models work to be able to go all the way to 2100?
So the short answer is yes, but that's not helpful.
No.
The longer answer there is, when people are doing climate modeling, first of all, there's a large number of different models. They're all governed by different research institution or research organizations.
Okay.
And they all represent the world a little bit differently. I mean, we all kind of agree on how to represent them, but you have different what are called parameterizations, and it's just different choices on the math of how different atmospheric processes come in, like how does it rain? How do we account for this storm? So that's one aspect of it. And that's not really influenced by decisions society makes.
Okay.
How they bring that in is through the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that drive the climate models and drive the changes. So one of the largest changes between the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their fifth assessment report, which is the one that came out in 2013,
Mm-hmm.
and the fourth assessment report, which came out in 2007-ish, is a change in how they approached the emissions. So
Okay.
under the fourth assessment report, they had emission scenario families, sort of, was how they were referring to them. And so there's four major ones, but they came up with all these scenarios, and they were based on socioeconomic decisions that we make as a globe, but also decisions that are made on a regional scale. So
Okay.
what if developing countries decide this,
Mm-hmm.
but a country that is established is making this decision? How does
Okay.
that look? And so they came up with all these storylines. And as you can imagine, people are very creative. It became unwieldy because there was so many storylines. And then how do you discuss your results from your studies in a meaningful manner when you don't know how this storyline compares to this storyline? So that's a challenge. To combat that, they said, let's just take a step back and develop some new emission scenarios. And they did it through an independent body. And they now have what are called representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. And they developed 4 main ones for the 5th assessment report, where they look at the amount of radiative forcing in the atmosphere. So how hot is it getting?
Okay.
And within that emission scenario, it can represent a whole bunch of different socioeconomic decisions. So that's how they communicate that information in. And they do have one which is called RCP 8.5, and that is considered the worst case scenario.
Okay.
Just letting her go, kind of business as usual. They have RCP 6, where you see less information on that, but things kind of peak and come down. You have RCP 4.5, which is more of a mid-range
Okay.
scenario, and then they had RCP 2.6, which is a much lower one and would require very, very aggressive handling of greenhouse gases.
And
And so
RCP stands for?
representative concentration pathway.
Okay. All right. So that's the
Yeah,
amount of pollutants in our atmosphere.
it's how much greenhouse gases are, like it's really the graph of how the greenhouse gases change over time.
Okay. Now I
And
understand.
so
Thank you.
that's what's used to drive the models. Now, we're coming up 2021, spring 2021, we should start seeing the first documents for the 6th assessment report. It's about a 7-year cycle that they introduce a new one, and that's exciting for me. It is a very interesting document. It will talk about what the state of climate science is, what we generally think is happening. But as part of that, they've also developed some new scenarios based on what's happened between 2013 and when they started their modeling exercise, and even their interim publication on the 1.5 degree warming. So they do try and take some of these socioeconomic things into account, but given that it is an atmospheric model, it's really the only place to put it in is through the emissions.
I know that due to the lockdowns, there's been a huge reduction in emissions just because a lot more people are working remotely. It's been positive in that regard. So if we have these types of events where, there's a huge reduction due to this, do we need to still be aggressive, or do we need to be more aggressive with regards to how we put all these major events together in terms of the new models? Like, do we have to assume that these events seem to be increasing in frequency and just keep increasing the frequency so that they're more robust? Or do you think we can relax a little bit because some of these events could actually be positive for climate change versus negative? COVID-19 is something to say that's the cure for climate change or anything like that. But these are things hard to predict. Like, how does the model calculate for that? Or is it just already been kind of theorized in these RPI graphs?
So the RPCs really is where it would be captured.
Okay.
They are designed to be more robust than their predecessors, which are the socioeconomic scenarios. How they take that into account is just honestly the level of greenhouse gases, and when do those peak, when do they drop off? If they peak, do they stay the same? Do they level down? And they've looked at different levels of aggression in terms of reducing the greenhouse gases. But one important thing to realize when you're talking about COVID is very short-lived when compared to the lifetime of a greenhouse gas. A greenhouse gas lives for hundreds of years, if not more. So
Oh,
even if we were to shut everything off now and not produce any more GHGs, it could take thousands of years for the temperatures to come down, because
okay.
it is that greenhouse effect. So yes, COVID is important. yes, COVID will reduce some greenhouse gases, but we still were making things in factories, like stuff was still happening. People were still driving a little bit. So there
Yeah.
is going to be some impact. But where we saw the strength of COVID and the positive benefits was in the local air quality. In some of
Okay.
these shorter term impacts where you see the local environment responding positively to the changes that we were making. And then as much as we can encourage that, it is going to have a positive impact in the long term. It's going to make it a more pleasant environment to live in. You're going to have a lot more of that biodiversity. So it is important to acknowledge that you will see the impacts of COVID, say, on air quality monitoring. You're
Okay.
going to see that drop the same way that you see a drop when Ontario closed its coal-fired power plant and they saw a huge drop in the SO2 that they were monitoring. We're going to see impacts in that way, but on a global scale, when you think of the amount of GHGs that are already there, plus the ones we added, it's not going to be as noticeable. So it doesn't mean we stop. It just means when you understand the system,
Mhm.
we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do, and we need to be a bit more aggressive in terms of reducing the greenhouse gases if we want to bring that temperature down. But even if you look up in the IPCC reports and you look at these representative concentration pathways, a lot of them go up and then it takes them a long time to come down. They don't just peak up and then peak back down because of the long-lived nature of the greenhouse gases.
Basically, even if we go with the reduction of greenhouse gases, that's not really our solution. We actually have to figure out a way to start extracting the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in order
Yeah,
to reduce the climate change.
that would have a very large impact. And the largest challenge with that is technologies that are at a good price point and
Yes.
technologies that can be employed en masse at a very large scale. So we're getting there. Like we are trying to innovate. We are trying to solve this problem. I don't mean to paint a hopeless picture to anybody,
No, no, no.
but the reality is when we face climate change, we have to look at climate change mitigation in the sense that we have to reduce the amount of gases that are going up in the atmosphere. We've got to look at climate mitigation in the sense that we've got to reduce not only what we're putting up, but what's there already. Can we extract some of that out? And then we look at the long lifetimes and say, okay, we need to figure out how to be resilient in the meantime. And that's why you have to look at adaptation with mitigation all the time. They have looked at studies to say, hey, if we just mitigate, is that enough? And the answer is no. And if we just do it adaptation, is that enough? And the answer is no. You've got to put the two of them together so we can continue to thrive while we're solving this problem.
You actually already answered my next question was what are our steps? So as you can hear, folks, basically it's not just about mitigation or adapting, but we actually have to start trying to reverse as well how we've been doing the GHGs. Wow, that's a lot to think about, and our future is very important to us, especially when you have young kids and you know that you're leaving the planet for them. What things do we need to do for the future?
There's two things that come to mind when I think about the future, mostly for what I'm trying to do with my own kids, what I'm trying to encourage them to do. And the first thing I would love people to do is to think about the actions that they're doing every day and how they can be a little bit more sustainable. And where I'm very encouraged is throughout COVID, while we've all been home, many of us have taken actions that have made our lives more sustainable without even realizing it, and we're still surviving, we're still moving forward. So there's a lot that you can do as one person just by making small decisions. And you start small and you build on it. We're not asking you to solve the problem in one day. Just do the best you can with what you have. The next thing is that climate change is not going to be solved only by climate scientists. And that sounds like a weird statement, but I need people from all backgrounds, from all disciplines, from all careers to help solve this problem. Well, I may be able to look at the technical side of things. I may need a social scientist to help me understand how the changes that I'm talking about will impact a community, and how do we help that community be resilient. I may need a great artist to help illustrate the concept, to help communicate to people that don't want to read a scientific document where the importance of this is. Everybody has so many talents, and they can all be used to help address this problem. I don't want people to get the impression because they don't like math or they're not good at science that they can't help with climate change. Everybody can help. You never know where the next innovation is going to come from or from whom. You just have to have an open mind.
That sounds good. I'd like to thank Dr. Kelly for her time and her patience on answering all my atmospheric climate change questions and giving a very good overview of exactly how we're changing and what we're doing to mitigate that, and how we need to be more conscious, a more sustainable approach to our projects and how we move forward as a society. Uh, Again, thank you, Dr. Kelly.
Thank
And,
you.
and this is Giovanni with the Save Planet podcast. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit subscribe so that we can continue to make more content.